This is a panel on the state of the Sentinel surveillance activities. We're going to hear from Robert Ball, the Deputy Director of the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at CDER, Mwango Khashoggi, the Associate Director for Safety at the Office of New Drugs at CDER as well, and Scott Presto, the Director of the Division of Epidemiology in the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology at CDER. These presentations are going to talk more about Sentinel activities, Sentinel improvements on and more on the current state of Sentinel safety surveillance. So, Bob, please go ahead.
Good morning. There's so many things to talk about. We'd be here for a couple of days, but I'm going to try to take a few minutes to take a deeper dive into the ARIA system that you've heard a couple of the previous speakers talk about, because it's really at the heart of how CDER is approaching the use of the Sentinel system now. As Gerald mentioned, in 2007, the FDA Amendments Act gave FDA a whole suite of new authorities, but it also required FDA to create the active post-market risk identification and analysis system, which FDA responded to this requirement by launching the Sentinel initiative. And to sort of get a little, I guess, wonkish here, this is the law that, the language from the law that links this system to FDA's authority to require post-marketing studies. And basically what it says is that FDA has to do a sufficiency analysis to say whether or not this system, this active post-market risk identification and analysis system, is sufficient to meet the purposes of the proposed post-market study. If this ARIA system is sufficient, then FDA cannot require a post-marketing study. If ARIA is not sufficient, then FDA can proceed on to launch this post-market requirement. So that's why this has become the core of how CDER is integrating Sentinel into its review and regulatory process. So what is ARIA? So we've defined ARIA as having two components. One is the automated analytic tools, and the other is the data that's available in the common data model. So you heard Rich talk a little bit about these tools using a different terminology, but they're basically these level 1, level 2, and level 3 analyses. And what this does is it puts protocol-based assessments outside of the ARIA system. So FDA can still use a protocol-based assessment if it desires, but in doing a sufficiency analysis, we focus on the analytic tools and the common data model. So Rich already went into some detail about these, and I'm just going to talk about them at a high level again. So a level 1 query gives us the descriptive analysis and unadjusted rates. A level 2 query allows us to do sophisticated adjusted analyses. And a level 3 query, in principle, allows us to do sequential adjusted analyses. Right now, the level 1 and level 2 programs are in what we consider to be production mode in ARIA. In level 3, or the sequential analysis, would be something that we would look for in the future. So then the important question is, what is sufficiency? So the way we look at sufficiency at a very high level, again, is that we have adequate data on the drug we're interested in studying, the health outcomes of interest, and the confounders, all in a common data model, that we have an appropriate method to answer the question of interest that's been turned into one of these automated tools, and that we can do this to a satisfactory level of precision. So this involves a combination of power and other concerns. On the bottom there, the FDA Amendments Act actually defines the study purposes, and we can assess a known serious risk related to the use of a drug, assess signals of a serious risk, or identify an unexpected serious risk when available data indicate the potential for a serious risk. So this sort of expands on the sort of types of questions that we might address in using ARIA. So how does this work? Again, at a very high level from a process point of view. So if a safety concern is raised and a determination is made by an FDA review team that an epidemiological assessment is desired, then we have a series of meetings where we ask the question, is ARIA sufficient? So this involves a kind of deep dive into the data and the methods, and write a memo describing what we think, whether or not we think ARIA is sufficient. If it's yes, then we move into an ARIA production mode. If it's no, then we can require a post-market study. We might also, at the same time, do a capability development or related study within Sentinel as part of one of the developmental activities, but outside of sort of this production environment. And just as a reminder that in the whole process that FDA uses for signal identification, signal refinement, and signal evaluation, we have our traditional tools, the case reports, registries, observational studies, and clinical trials. And Sentinel and ARIA sort of fit into this, but Sentinel also has a whole set of other activities. And you heard Steve mention TreeScan earlier as a data mining activity. And we can use protocol-based assessments as well, along with the tools for sort of purposes outside of specifically the ARIA process. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So I am going to expand on an aspect of Bob's talk that he highlighted, and that is also what has been mentioned in previous comments from speakers, and that's with regard to integration of the use of Sentinel analyses into the drug review process. So the Sentinel database is, we all understand it, is another valuable information source for further characterization of drug safety signals. And not only can it be used after a drug is approved for identification of new safety signals or further evaluation of known signals, it can also be used during the review of new and supplemental marketing applications to add to what is known about drug use or drug effects. So for example, in the context of review of a supplemental application for an already approved drug, if the application is for a new indication or new treatment, we can get additional information about drug use as well as any experiences of the population that's already been treated with the product. And if a drug, for example, if there's an application for a new drug in the class, we can use Sentinel data to inform our understanding of experiences with other products in the class so that we can use that information in our assessment of this marketing application currently under review. So additionally, with the augmented capabilities of the Sentinel system, and specifically with regard to ARIA, when there are serious safety concerns that FDA determines warrant further evaluation, as I said, either at the time of approval or after approval, we must now consider the sufficiency of ARIA in terms of making that further evaluation of the safety concern. And as Bob just described, and it's almost like a series of negatives, if we determine that ARIA is not sufficient, then we would issue a requirement to this drug sponsor for a study or trial post-marketing. But if it is ARIA is determined to be sufficient, then we would conduct that analysis of the safety issue within the ARIA system, and a PMR would not be issued. So CEDAR, as Gerald had alluded to and Bob as well, is defining and refining its processes for determining the sufficiency of ARIA. And during the drug review process, whether for a new application or a supplemental marketing application, this process of ARIA sufficiency determination is very important because, as many people know, there are associated timelines for that drug review process. So the schematic that I'm showing in this slide is probably very familiar to many, but I'll just describe it briefly. It's taken from CEDAR's desk reference guide, and it describes our process for review of applications. And at the top of the diagram are certain milestones, such as when the application is filed, as well as when there are key meetings of the review team that's assessing the application. The middle of the diagram summarizes phases and certain activities of the drug review process. And at the bottom, we have timelines shown in months, and that shows the period of the review. I've superimposed on this diagram 2 red lines towards the top, and the dashed line is intended to indicate the period during the review process in which Sentinel analyses could be used to augment the information that's contained within the application. And the solid line, which is between the mid-cycle and the wrap-up meetings of the review team, indicates the period of time when the review team will be having more intense conversations about particular safety concerns and conducting this assessment or determination of the sufficiency of ARIA to address that safety concern. So, as I said, that we are defining and refining our processes for determining ARIA sufficiency. There are scientific considerations to be made, as Bob just walked us through, and there are also procedural issues that we have to take into account. Our teams are very complex, timelines are fast, and there's a lot that we need to accomplish during the review of the application. The staff in the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology within CEDAR take the lead on our Sentinel analyses, but staff in other offices have critical roles to play as well. For example, the staff in Office of New Drugs bring clinical expertise and can help refine the clinical question, and staff in our Office of Biostatistics help with the statistical analysis planning for the assessment of the safety concern. And you'll hear more about the nature of these team interactions in the context of ARIA sufficiency determinations in our later talks this afternoon. Now, obviously, clear communication across teams is very important during this ARIA sufficiency determination process. We've got to have things that people understand the basics, such as timeframes for going through this work. And we need to be clear and timely in our discussions of the issues and the purpose of the evaluation, because those form the core of determining the sufficiency of ARIA. So in addition to assuring good communication about Sentinel analyses during the review of safety signals, it's important to also be clear in our communication once the analyses are conducted and results are available. We are continuing to formalize a process within CEDAR of sharing information across teams and across offices, and really having more discussions about interpretation of results, particularly in the context of other information that's available about the drug and the safety issue. It's very important for us to understand the strengths and limitations of the analysis that was performed, or the analysis that would be performed in ARIA. Dr. Platt has mentioned the Sentinel Initiative webpage, where there's a lot of information about activities as well as results. One thing that is important is, as we continue to integrate the use of Sentinel analyses into our review process, is communication with drug sponsors about planned and completed analyses. And we're working through formalization of those procedures so that there can be consistency in terms of how that's done. So all of this is to say that we are committed to because it's very, very important to us and for public health, to integrating the use of Sentinel into the drug review process, both pre and post-approval. We're looking to our existing documentation about how we think about evaluation of post-market, of signals in the post-market period, and looking to see how we can incorporate our policies and procedures into either existing documents or additional documents, so that staff and the public, as well as our stakeholders in terms of sponsors, have this information. Thank you.
Thanks, Mwango. Scott's up next.
Good morning. My name is Scott Presto. I'm Director of Epidemiology at FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. I would like to share just very briefly a few comments on how CBER has been integrating Sentinel in our regulatory work. So just to start off, we received the Sentinel data as part of in the environment of getting safety data from many sources. We certainly have the pre-market safety data, which is generally clinical trial data. We have spontaneous adverse event reports that we receive through FAERS and VAERS, which I suspect you're familiar with. Obviously, we survey the medical literature. We have routine teleconferences with other regulatory authorities, such as the EMA. And as far as Sentinel, there are many uses. It's a very rich, large data resource, but certainly signal detection is something that we're investigating. And obviously, there's the ability to do pharmacoepidemiologic studies. We also have other sources for pharmacoepi studies, such as the vaccine safety data link, which actually CDC does. And we use the CMS data as well. So it's all part of really a network of safety data coming into us that we need to integrate. So as far as the CBER use of Sentinel data, as Dr. Anderson's already mentioned, we've traditionally used the protocol-based assessments over the last number of years. We believe that ARIA is becoming more and more sophisticated and more useful, and so there is some movement for us to go towards more use of ARIA. And I did want to actually just mention, in case you're not familiar with CBER, we oversee three major product areas, the prophylactic vaccines, blood and blood products, as well as cellular and gene therapies. So CBER actually held a workshop on PRISM just very recently. So I thought it would be nice to talk about blood scan. This is a tool that's been developed for surveillance of blood and blood products. It can use up to and including all of the data partners, and it uses claims data as well as electronic health records. Recently, we've been able to use inpatient blood transfusion data, which has been very important for improved surveillance. And as a way of introducing you to blood scan in a very short time frame, I'd like to do a very brief short case study looking at immune globulin and thromboembolic events, work that has recently been done, not by me, but by others, and I will give you the full list of names soon. So very quickly, what is IVIG? It's immune globulin that's been pooled from donor plasma. It has a number of uses, both approved and unapproved. The major uses certainly are for immune deficiency diseases, as well as autoimmune and inflammatory disorders. So the question that has been around really since 1986, so this is I think a nice example of uses for Sentinel. Sometimes there are new safety issues that come up that we want to try to address. Some of the issues can be fairly old, but we need to know more about them. So there was a case series first reported on thromboembolic events with IVIG in 1986. FDA has received spontaneous adverse event reports as well, showing concern for this event. Laboratory work has been done to show that the product certainly appears to be thrombogenic, both inherently as well as the potential for contaminants. A warning label was first put on the products in 2002, and we had a pharmacoepi study performed with health core claims data, which indicated what appeared to be an increased risk for same-day thromboembolic events following IVIG use. We have a box warning in 2013 on the products, and yet there were still questions that we felt needed to be answered. Certainly the magnitude of the risk wasn't completely clear, and whether there were certain risk factors for individuals who might develop this problem. So a protocol-based assessment was performed. It's a retrospective, self-controlled risk interval design. I'm not sure who knows what that means, but just briefly, this is using patients as their own control. We have, based on prior data, what we think to understand to be the risk period following exposure to the product. So what's being done is we compare that risk period following exposure to a risk period that occurs distant from the exposure and try to understand if there is an increase in risk. The patients who were looked at received their first exposure to IVIG either in between 2006 and 2012. Ultimately, 14 data partners were used, and medical record confirmation was also used with physician adjudicators. As I mentioned, the goal was to estimate the increased relative risk, as well as look for potential risk factors. And it's a 5-minute talk. You didn't really think I was going to give you the results, presumably. So it's coming to you on a Sentinel website near you. And this is just to remind me to tell you that we're getting safety data from multiple sources, but we have the same regulatory decisions that we need to make, and it can go from continued monitoring to market withdrawal. And so that's how an example of how we're integrating Sentinel data. And I did want to give a number of acknowledgments. This is not my work. It's the work of the people that you see on the screen. It's I shamelessly simplified what they've done. It's an impressive body of work. I hope you look at it. It's, well, I'll just say that it's impressive. And I did want to thank my slide reviewers. They made me use larger font, so you have them to thank. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for that. Thanks, too. We have time for a couple of questions. If there are any, please use the microphones. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Sheila Weiss, independent consultant. You hear me? Okay. My question, several of you spoke to these sufficiency analyses, and companies often come to me when you ask them to do PMS study, and sometimes it is really not very feasible. So my question is, what's the extent of transparency in providing those to the companies so that they can have that information when they start to look at doing their own study? I'd suggest maximum transparency. And then the second one is related is, if it's not feasible in the Sentinel, is it even feasible at all? And is there any discussion of that when there is a decision to request a post-marketing study? Thank you.
So I'll start maybe with your... Yeah. I'll start with your second question about feasibility. So because the ARIA system is based on the common data model and the available tools, there would be plenty of situations where the ARIA would be found to be insufficient, but where the study is still feasible. So for example, if there's a health outcome of interest that would require a medical record review, that would be completely feasible. It just would require a full-blown sort of protocol-based assessment, and that's not part of the ARIA process. For the first part of your question about the transparency, yeah, I mean, our intent is for these to be available, the insufficiency analyses, and I think maybe I'll let Mwango answer.
So if, in terms of post-marketing requirements that are issued, for example, at the time of approval, the documentation of the basis for the requirement is supposed to be, in part, the template that is completed that describes the nature of the study or trial that's being issued, as well as the rationale for it. What we are now in the process of doing is augmenting our documentation such that there's a summary description of the determination as to whether or not ARIA was sufficient incorporated into our description of the rationale for the PMR or the PMC if one is issued. The other sorts of documentation are also available, and everyone's going to cringe when I say this. You can send a FOIA request because everything is available. But if you're interested in terms of new applications new drugs that are approved or supplements that are approved, and wanting to know at that time what is the agency's thinking, you can look in the action package, because the PMR PMC development template that is completed will describe some of that, as well as in the reviews. I believe the other, like specifically, for example, on the part of OSC, their analysis of ARIA sufficiency is also documented, and that can also be requested.
With the recent developments and further steps coming on Sentinel and this general approach to active post-market surveillance, using distributed systems, common data models, curated data, how are you seeing the boundary shift between where ARIA sufficiency is determined, where it's not, and more work is needed in post-market studies? What should people be expecting in the next few years?
So I think the main point is that what ARIA sufficiency gives us is it'll give us a body of experience with the common data model and the automated tools that will help us to identify where it works and where it doesn't. And for us, that's going to be important for making strategic investments in both new data sources and new tools. So Steve mentioned electronic health record data. And then there's an IMEDS project on obtaining data through mobile apps on patients. So those are sort of two examples of other data sources that over time we're hoping to figure out how to integrate more completely to expand the number of times that ARIA is sufficient.
All right, I'd like to thank our panel for a great discussion of all of the current Sentinel activities. Thank you all very much.